Now a discussion on U.S. strategy in Afghanistan. We'll hear from former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski. That's followed by a discussion on the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. This is hosted by the RAND Corporation.
Michael Rich, who in turn will be introducing Dr. Brzezinski. I'm David Aaron, Director of the Center for Middle East Public Policy at the RAND Corporation, and I will be popping up periodically as your Master of Ceremonies. But again, thank you all for coming. Michael?
Well, good morning. Today's discussion has been organized by RAND Center for Middle East Public Policy. So David is the director. You'll meet some other people who are involved in that center, both on our board as well as researchers at RAND. We have Senator Lugar to thank for this marvelous venue. We're very appreciative of his efforts, the efforts of his staff. And I also want to thank Steve Clemens and the New America Foundation for their help with logistical support. The RAND Corporation was founded now over 61 years ago based on a very simple proposition, which is that rigorous and objective analysis helps decision makers make and carry out better policy. And in that spirit, we'll focus this morning on the war in and around Afghanistan. Our discussion, of course, could not be more timely. General McChrystal has delivered a report which is said to recommend the addition of perhaps 40,000 additional troops to reinforce his counterinsurgency strategy. The President and his national security team are analyzing and debating the merits of that recommendation and presumably of alternatives as well. After the President decides on a course of action, the Congress will have hearings, and we have a chance this morning to hear a stellar group of strategists illuminate the main classes of options, their underlying rationales, their risks, and their irreducible uncertainties. So would the addition of, say, 40,000 troops ensure the success of our counterinsurgency strategy? What about 20,000 or 60,000? It is commonly assumed that the lower levels of troop commitments entail more risk. If so, are the resulting savings in money and manpower large enough to make that kind of trade-off attractive? Some argue that the coalition should scale back its objectives and concentrate not on the insurgents trying to topple the regime in Kabul, but instead on the terrorists on the AfPak border. What are the chances that this course will be successful? What would such a shift mean for the insurgency in Afghanistan and stability in Pakistan? Are these risks acceptable, given that the costs in manpower and in dollars are most likely lower? Today's discussion, we hope, will shed light on all of these cost-risk trade-offs, and I expect that we'll learn quite a bit about such questions as, are there vital national interests at stake, and if so, exactly what are they? Are those interests threatened by terrorists or insurgents or both or neither? To what extent does addressing one threat require combating the other? Can the United States advance toward its objective without stabilizing Afghanistan and without destabilizing Pakistan? Is there such a thing as a good Taliban and a bad Taliban? What kind of threat does al-Qaeda pose to the United States today? How important are territorial sanctuaries to a networked terrorist threat? I hope we'll cover all of those today. Now, a brief overview of the plan. We'll have three panel discussions. The first one focused on counterinsurgency, the next focused on counterterrorism, and then one focused on containment, each of them moderated by a top-flight journalist who has been following the situation very closely. At lunch, we'll hear from Ambassadors Al-Khalilzad and Senator Carl Levin. But to launch our examination of assumptions and alternatives, I cannot think of anyone better than Zbigniew Brzezinski. Dr. Brzezinski long ago achieved a stature that makes a customary introduction unnecessary. I will just remind you that he has a long and distinguished career in both academia and in government service, and that he's a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. At RAND, we're very fortunate to have him serve as the chair of the advisory board for our Center for Middle East Public Policy, and all of us are fortunate to have him deliver our keynote address today. So, Dr. Brzezinski.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, those of you who may have come here on the assumption that I'm going to stand here and solve the Afghan dilemma are going to be very disappointed. I know that may be the course of events this morning, culminating in the keynote address by Senator Levin. So I'll leave it to him to tell you how the problem should be dealt with. What I will do instead is to attempt to share with you some basic, and I mean basic, strategic guidelines within which the fundamental decisions that shape U.S. policy are to be made. In effect, what I will communicate are essentially a list of some do's and some no's. There are basically three fundamental no's, and there are 10 do's in my presentation. The first point, very simply, is, as a matter of policy choice, a withdrawal from Afghanistan in the near future is a no-no. I think we all know what this would produce, not only for Afghanistan, but also for Pakistan, and very much so for the United States and its position in the world. So that is not in the range of policy options. My second one may be more controversial, but it's also a no-no. Namely, there should be, in our choice of policy, no de facto repetition of the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. And that, to me, means that we should not Americanize the counterinsurgency, because if we do, we really do run the risk of repeating the Soviet experience. For some strange reason, the Afghans don't like foreigners with guns in their country resolving their problems. The third no is that there should be no solitary U.S. military engagement in whatever policy decision we make, that others should be there with us. Certainly, NATO has to be there because it made a decision to be there, and we ought to use all of our leverage to make sure that this sticks and that decisions are made jointly. There is the proposal from the French and the Germans, or is it from the Germans and the Brits, for a conference on Afghanistan, and I think we're going to move that way. In addition, if we can have more Islamic troops as part of the international presence in Afghanistan, that is very much to be desired, perhaps even from the nearby countries. So these are the sort of three fundamental no's that exclude certain grand options, which, to all intents and purposes, I think it is evident that, in fact, they are being excluded. Now, what are the do's? The first is to focus on a realistic central objective, the central strategic objective. And as I have argued previously, that means accomplishing an outcome that denies safe haven to al-Qaeda in Afghanistan because of our intervention, but also as a byproduct of our engagement in the area, also in Pakistan. That is a grand central objective, but it ought to be the objective. It is not a question of nation building, it is not a question of establishing democracy. Secondly, in seeking that objective, we have to be extremely sensitive to the ethnic diversity of Afghanistan. We have to be aware of the fact that concentrating on creating an effective central national government could disrupt the long-standing, historical, and very sensitive accommodation between the different component parts of the Afghan population. We tend to overlook sometimes in our discussions that this kind of historical compact is potentially subject to disruption because of the rise of nationalism and because of the appearance of nation states based on ethnicity right next to Afghanistan, within which there are populations of the same ethnicity as the new nation states. Let us remind ourselves, in case we have forgotten, that the population of Afghanistan includes about 14 or so million of, that number is an estimate because there's no precise public poll, about 14 or so, between 12 and 14 million Pashtuns. It includes close to 8 million Tajiks who have fought extremely well. Some of you might remember the what was that valley called? What? Panjshir, the Panjshir Valley, and Massoud. These are people who know how to fight. They fought against the Soviets as Afghans, but also as Tajiks. There is something like 3 million Uzbeks, also with the country next door. Then there are others. There are the Hazaris, for example, about 2.5 or so million. There are Kyrgyz. There are Turkmens. Now note, almost all of the foregoing have now independent countries next door. They didn't in the past. The internal Afghan accommodation has lasted historically because it's been very indirect, very delicate, and very respectful of these realities. And a counterinsurgency campaign which fails to discriminate between these accommodations is likely simply to create more problems for itself. That leads me to my third do. Yes, we have to shape a national Afghan army and an Afghan police force. But how should we go about it? There's talk of sending in thousands of American trainers, and in the course of 2 years, shaping a force of about 400,000 men, cumulatively, in the national army and in the police force. Well, first of all, I'm not quite sure that this is compatible with my previous point. Namely, I doubt very much that the Tajiks and the Uzbeks and the others really want to be policed by a force created from the central government, and presumably more so of a Pashtun character. So that's a very important consideration. Secondly, I'm not even sure that from a military point of view, it's a very good idea. I have looked more closely, for example, at the way the Soviets suppressed counterinsurgency right after the end of the war in what became communist Poland, but also in Western Ukraine. In both places, to the extent possible, they recruited local forces built from supporters for communism, who were very much in the minority, incidentally, but who were deeply committed. They stayed in the background. The insurgencies were crushed largely by these local forces with Soviet support in the background. Someone might argue, yes, but we have to train and prepare these people. My answer to that is very simple. Who trains the Taliban? Who's providing all this professional training to the Taliban, which is fighting so well? And the answer, I think, is the Taliban knows how to fight because now that's part of their political culture. It's also part of the experience of the last 20 years. If we provide enough uniforms and boots and weapons, and particularly recruit people on a local basis and pay them reasonably well, we could have, I am convinced, in short order, a fairly substantial Afghan militia that would be, I think, much more capable of combating the insurgency and particularly the Taliban. My fourth, so to speak, due point is that, yes, it may be necessary to put in more troops. I am not in a position to judge. I only read McChrystal's report In its public version, I'm not quite sure what these additional forces he wants are supposed to be doing, but in my view, perhaps we may have to increase their number, but in my view, for the purpose, first of all, of absolutely holding the cities, most of the major towns, to control the major roads in Afghanistan. That's absolutely essential. And then perhaps, if specifically justified, undertake some essential counterinsurgency activities if they're designed to prevent some very negative development from occurring, but not more than that. Fifth, certainly pursue local accommodations with those Taliban formations or other Taliban-like formations, provided it is understood that the accommodation involves the exclusion of any safe haven or collaboration with Al-Qaeda. Sixth, of course, keep economic assistance flowing, thereby negating the mistake we made right after the end of the counter-Soviet opposition by the Mujahideen, when we, in effect, abandoned Afghanistan in its misery and refrained from shoring up a viable alternative, which in turn permitted the rise of the Taliban. That assistance flowing in an ink blot fashion could gradually spread from the towns and districts to more outlying areas, but have no illusion about it. It's going to be a slow and very differentiated process, but one that is necessary. First, to shape up the more modern parts of Afghanistan, then to consolidate more generally social stability, and then to seduce the rest of the population as the ink blot process expands. 7, of course, involve the Europeans, not just in the military aspects as defined, but particularly in funding the elimination of the narcotic crops in Afghanistan. The simple and brutal fact of life is that Europe is a major consumer of the narcotic products originating from Afghanistan, just as we are, for example, in the case of Colombia. And we don't expect the Europeans to help us eradicate the narcotic crops in Colombia, directly or indirectly. The Europeans should assume the financial obligation to buy out the producers of these crops. And I think this is something doable, and it would be, to some extent, a substitute for a more direct and intensified European military effort, from which now some Europeans are beginning to disengage. 8, we ought to be more respectful, and directly so, and clearly so, of the Pakistani strategic interest in Afghanistan. Unless we are, we'll never get a 100% good faith effort from the Pakistanis. They're quite prepared to fight well and with real determination to safeguard Pakistan for the Pakistanis. And I think the evidence is quite clear that the vast majority of the Pakistani elite, of the upper classes, of most of the population is against the Taliban taking over Pakistan. The same sensitivity, the same one-sided majority does not exist regarding Pakistan's effort in Afghanistan, and particular efforts designed to exclude and isolate the Taliban. And there is a very good reason for this from the Pakistani point of view. They are afraid that a non-Taliban Afghanistan could be a neutral Afghanistan in a generic sense, but a de facto, informal partner of India. And that obviously raises very major security problems for the Pakistanis. And we have to be sensitive to that. That involves some difficult diplomatic choices, not to mention military and economic financial assistance, but it has to be faced squarely. I don't think we have faced it squarely enough. 9, we ought to engage more, both China and Iran, insofar as their concerns regarding Afghanistan are involved. Both countries do have a stake in an outcome that's more or less tolerable. The Chinese are concerned about the spread of militant Islamism in the area, and they're even more concerned about what might happen to Pakistan in the course of this rather dynamic and unpredictable conflict. They have a very major stake in a healthy, geopolitically friendly Pakistan. I think China could be helpful to us in creating some sort of a diplomatic process in the area in which we would try in some way to reassure the Pakistanis, but at the same time not create a situation that the Indians would view as threatening. The Iranians have an obvious stake in Afghanistan, in which there is a sizable Hazara community that's Shiite. They were helpful to us in 2002. I could envisage, especially if the negotiating process with Iran moves forward in a positive way, that they could become more helpful again. That certainly has to be part of any large strategic package. And then last but not least, even though at this moment that may seem remote, I think we ought to be more actively engaged in promoting and eventually supporting a north-south pipeline through Afghanistan to the Indian Ocean. That has some bearing on my previous point, because that would be an undertaking very much of interest to the Indians, and the Indians need access to the energy resources of Central Asia. It would help to flow funds into Afghanistan and thus contribute also to the desirable object of helping Afghanistan develop economically. It would create a wider regional interest in a Pacific Afghanistan. In brief, these are sort of my major points regarding the issues before us. It is within this framework that if I were engaged in making the decision, I would try to resolve the specific military issue that has been posed by General McChrystal. In brief and in conclusion, therefore, a decision regarding the military choices has to be made within a wide-ranging geostrategic framework in which these factors are weighed and cumulatively determine what kind specifically of a military engagement the United States should be pursuing in the months and years to come. Let me end on a very broad note, but it's relevant to this. Afghanistan, extending to Pakistan, is not the only problem we face in the region. We face a problem with Iran. We face a potential problem with Iraq, particularly as we continue our disengagement. We face a potential condition of unrest in the Middle East if the Israeli-Palestinian discussions should falter. All of that should serve as a reminder to us that in the long run, it is not in our interest to be the only major power deeply and increasingly deeply involved in what is now the world's most turbulent region which has a suction effect on our power. We have to think of this in a longer-term historical perspective. Our policy in Afghanistan is not going to solve the others. The other issues are not going to help us solve Afghanistan, but the interrelationship between them is such that if all of them are not handled intelligently with a strategic design in mind, the United States could end up being bogged down for years and years to come. 3.5 months from now, the war in Afghanistan will be the second longest war in American history. In 6 months from now, it will be the longest war in American history. And I don't think it is exaggeration to express the concern that unless we are very clever about our policy in Afghanistan, we could end up being bogged down in that country, but in the region as a whole, in a self-destructive fashion for another decade or so. The cumulative impact of that on America's world role would be utterly devastating. So the choices we're going to be making in the next few weeks have a truly long-range significance to them. Thank you.
Dr. Brzezinski has agreed to take a few questions. Let me remind you that we are all being videotaped here, and so would you please, when you come to the microphone, identify yourselves. Thank you.
Judge and freelance correspondent, Bethesda Mellon. First, thank you for your coming. And you have provided a realistic central objective, but the nation don't have a central objective yet. So how do you make a nation come out with a consensus and a realistic and central objective? Thank you.
You mean within the United States? Is that your question?
Pardon?
How do we create consensus within the United States?
Yeah. We really don't have an objective yet. Thank you.
Okay, I get it. That's obviously, in the first instance, up to the president to define. The president took a general step in that direction in the spring. And it has, to some extent, been both accepted and has become part of the general perspective we have on Afghanistan. So a step on this direction has already been made. But I do think that if the president now defines his policies in a sharper, more focused fashion than heretofore has been the case, he ought to address the country and speak about it. We went into Afghanistan as a reaction to 9/11. For the next 8 or so years, our engagement in Afghanistan was part of the war on terror. The war on terror, in turn, was identified with across-the-board hostility towards Islam, all of the talk about Islamic terrorism. And hence, the president, who has already disassociated himself from the war of terror as the central defining principle of America's involvement in the world, has, I think, the political need to develop a more sharply focused definition of our engagement and of the balance between the different elements of foreign policy in the course of waging it, namely the political, the economic, the social, the regional, as well as the military. I would hope that the president would do that. He's extremely eloquent. He's quite effective as a communicator. I think the country would have a better understanding of this problem if he were to lay it out, and I suspect one way or another he will because of the intense public interest in the current deliberations. Please.
Mohammed Kasem, I'm a retired world banker and also from South Asia. 3 points. From experts I honor, at peak they said Al-Qaeda was 1,000 people. And in December, maybe 100. So you spent $10 billion to go after 1,000 Wahhabis? Secondly, these states are conceits. Afghanistan's borders were drawn by 3 Brits and 1 Russian. Pakistan, 2 Brits. These are not sustainable. You know, this divide and rule, the Pashtun were cut, Baluchis were cut, Uzbeks were cut, and they're fighting each other. And also now you've got the 3rd Christian army to invade Afghanistan. Is this system sustainable? The US is a status quo power. Is this a futile effort to send in troops rather than saying, accept the fact there's going to be change, the British Empire is finally over?
Well, that's well and good, but there is still the problem that Al-Qaeda does exist. It may not have too many people involved in it, but it is an organization with more or less an international web of support for it. And we have to be very prudent that they are not provided a sanctuary in which they could undertake more sustained planning and then eventually truly lethal operations against the United States. So focusing on Al-Qaeda as the basic objective, I think makes sense, but it should not be conditioned on fundamental changes in the nature of the country in which it has self-haven. I mean, we could face the same problem vis-a-vis Pakistan. And if somehow or other Al-Qaeda couldn't find safe haven in Afghanistan or Pakistan, it might find safe haven somewhere else in the world. I don't want to mention countries because it may sound invidious, but there are plenty of places which are not well governed, in which perhaps through a local accommodation, Al-Qaeda could establish a new base of operations. And I do not think it's a good precedent for the United States to feel obligated to invade every country in which Al-Qaeda has a presence, and then in that course undertake, quote unquote, a nation-building exercise that will last for years. I was very marginally involved in the decision to go into Afghanistan after 9/11, in the sense that I was one of several people who were brought in at consultations at the highest level. And in the final decision-making meeting, the Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld shared with us the basic notions of the military operation to eliminate al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and in the process, of course, the Taliban regime as well. And I fully endorsed it. But afterwards, I sent him a note saying that in the light of what I know about Afghanistan, my knowledge is derived largely from the failed Soviet experience in Afghanistan, I would urge the United States, after accomplishing its objective, to leave immediately and not to stay trying to engage in nation building. Now, when I mean to leave immediately, I don't mean to disengage totally and to ignore its existence, but not to stay there with force, not to stay there with alien force, because that, to me, is the fundamental weakness of our position. How else can one explain the fact that we overthrew the Taliban with 300 special forces, plus a lot of Afghan support for us, stemming in part from their affinity towards us because of our help against the Soviets? And yet, 8 years later, our commanding officer tells us, having 100,000 troops under his command, 60,000 Americans, 40,000 NATO, that the military picture is beginning to turn against us. What has happened in the course of these 8 years? Somehow or other, a sufficiently lethal group of Afghans, united by fanatical beliefs, a concept of a medieval society that they wish to preserve, have created a military situation that we cannot handle with 100,000 troops. Surely there is a lesson in that from which we have to extract some relevant strategic conclusions. Yes, sir.
Your very first rule for what we should not do was we shouldn't get out anytime soon, and yet about half of Americans oppose this occupation. You suggested that that was the rule that wouldn't be controversial. You didn't need to explain it to us, yet it strikes me as considerably controversial. We have a diplomat who just resigned because he couldn't figure out what we were doing there, believed the occupation was increasing hostilities. We have a newspaper reporter held hostage whose testimony is to the effect that the anger is against the foreign occupation. For the benefit of the half of Americans who don't actually take that as common sense, could you give some explanation for that first rule?
Well, first of all, I think that attitude is understandable, but it's also susceptible to change. If the president comes up with a strategy that sounds reasonable and in which he makes an effective case for sticking with it, which means not disengaging rapidly, I think the percentages could shift. Beyond that, I don't think the fact that there is a significant public view that we ought to disengage needs to be decisive in any decision. One has to look beyond the immediate reactions. The public fatigue with the war is understandable. We've been there for 8 years. All of a sudden, we discover we're not winning it. According to our military commanders, the fatigue is understandable, but it's politically to be dealt with. I think the president needs to make a strong case, if I may be so bold to put it this way, that encompasses those points that I made, the 10 do's and the 3 don'ts, because I think a case to that effect probably would be persuasive to much of the country. Also, incidentally, if he decided to disengage, you can well imagine the outcry that would be in the country if you're judging this purely on political basis. And the president would be absolutely condemned by his political opponents. And I don't even need to identify them by name, but they would be extremely articulate. So while this is a relevant consideration, it certainly is not a decisive one in shaping what we ought to be doing. Yes, sir.
Name is Mark Hagerott. I'll be accompanying General Caldwell in a few weeks over to Afghanistan on the command that will build the Afghan military. Wanted to bring you back to your point about perhaps not building a large 400,000-man Afghan military, but incentivize local groups. If you could address 2 questions about that. One, the question of local warlordism, if you build and enhance these local groups. And secondly, you gave the example of, I believe, the Soviet battle against the insurgency in Ukraine, but you had a large central power in the Soviet Union, which we wouldn't have unless we have a large military there. So if you could address those 2 points, it would be helpful.
Yes, well, insofar as the second point is concerned, the Ukrainian part was somewhat marginal to my major point, which was in a country of about 40 million people, 25 million at the time, Poland, the Soviets crushed the domestic resistance, which was very strong, with minimum use of their own force and with maximum use of local militias recruited from the politically activated new sort of establishment in the communist-ruled country, namely the workers, industrial workers, and landless peasants. And using these elements, which had the support at most of about 15% of the population, they were able to crush a major resistance movement. As far as the warlordism is concerned, well, we can call these people anything we want. We can call them warlords. That's derived actually from the Chinese experience. Or we can call them corrupt, which we like to do whenever we want to disengage and find an excuse for leaving. We can call them whatever we want, but the fact is they're part and parcel of the traditional arrangement in Afghanistan. The more we disrupt it, the more likely the opposition will intensify. The more we can play through it, the more likely we can actually eliminate the Taliban, which, according to available information right now, the vast majority of the Afghans still do not want to see again in power.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brzezinski. I'm sorry to say that we have run out of time for this very, very interesting thing. Thank you for coming. This couldn't be a better beginning, I think, to our conference. And I want to express the gratitude not only of the audience, but of the RAND Corporation for your participation in this today. For our first panel, I would like to introduce our moderator, Peter David. He will introduce the panelists. Peter has been a Washington bureau chief of the